Hello there, weary traveller, and welcome to this cozy corner of history. Before we begin our journey back to the brutal civil wars of ancient Egypt, I wanted to extend a warm greeting to you, dear listener. Whether you're nestled under the covers, ready to drift off to sleep, or simply looking to unwind with some quiet historical storytelling, I'm so glad you've chosen to join me tonight. The golden pyramids gleaming under the desert sun, the mighty Sphinx gazing eternally across the sands, the treasure-filled tombs of god-kings who ruled for millennia. These are the images that likely come to mind when you think of ancient Egypt. A civilization of unparalleled grandeur and stability that endured for thousands of years. But beneath this postcard-perfect facade lies a darker truth. Ancient Egypt wasn't always the unified, harmonious kingdom we imagine. The land of the pharaohs was periodically torn apart by vicious civil wars that pitted Egyptian against Egyptian in conflicts so brutal they threatened to erase everything the civilization had built. These weren't just political squabbles. They were existential crises that shook Egyptian society to its very foundations. Picture, if you will, a peaceful village along the fertile banks of the Nile. Farmers tend their fields under the watchful gaze of local officials. Traders hawk their wares in bustling markets. Children splash and play in the life-giving waters of the river. Life flows as predictably as the Nile's annual flood, until suddenly, it doesn't. Rumors spread like wildfire through the settlement. The pharaoh is dead, but no clear successor has emerged. Two royal brothers both claim the double crown. Provincial governors begin raising armies. Priests issue contradictory proclamations about divine favor. The village headman calls an emergency meeting, and you can see the fear etched on his face. Everyone must choose a side. Therefore, loyalties fracture. Neighbor turns against neighbor, and brother against brother. I must admit, there's something rather darkly amusing about how quickly human societies can unravel. One day, you're enjoying a nice beer with your brother-in-law, discussing the annual flood predictions. But the next day, you're considering whether that same brother-in-law's head might look better on a pike because he supports the wrong pharaoh. Talk about awkward family dinners. Though I suppose family drama hasn't changed much in 4,000 years. It's just that our Thanksgiving arguments rarely end with someone being mummified. The village that once hummed with peaceful industry now transforms into a fortress. Fields lie untended as men march off to war. Foreign mercenaries, who would have been viewed with suspicion in peacetime, now camp within the village walls. Women frantically store grain, knowing that famine inevitably follows bloodshed. Children no longer play by the river, therefore they learn to watch the horizon for approaching armies. And then the Nile, that eternal, life-giving artery of Egyptian civilization, runs red with the blood of the fallen. The river that birthed this magnificent culture now bears witness to its self-destruction. The gods themselves seem to weep as Egyptian steel cuts down Egyptian flesh. In the coming hour, we'll explore how ordinary Egyptians survived these cataclysmic periods. We'll witness families torn apart by competing loyalties. We'll see royal blood spilled in palace coups and harem conspiracies. We'll follow refugees fleeing across burning sands. And we'll marvel at how, time and again, Egyptian civilization managed to rebuild from the ashes of civil conflict. So, pull your blankets a little tighter, dear listener. The tale I'm about to tell you may have unfolded beneath the scorching Egyptian sun, but I promise it will send a shiver down your spine. For there is nothing more terrifying in human history than the moment when civilization's masks slip away, revealing the fragile, brutal reality that lies beneath. And nowhere is this truer than in the story of ancient Egypt's civil wars, where brother fought brother beneath the unblinking gaze of the eternal gods. But take heart, even in humanity's darkest hours, there are always stories of courage, resilience, and hope to light our way. And those are the stories that, in the end, truly matter. As the blood-red sun rises over the twin lands of Egypt, it casts long shadows across a civilization balanced on a knife's edge. Most of us imagine ancient Egypt as a monolithic kingdom, stable and unchanging for millennia. a place where pharaohs ruled with divine authority. Pyramids reached toward the heavens, and life flowed with the rhythm of the Nile. But this comforting image masks a far more complex reality. Egypt was, from its very inception, a divided land. Two kingdoms, Upper and Lower Egypt, existed long before their fabled unification. Upper Egypt stretched south from Memphis, following the Nile Valley toward Nubia. Lower Egypt encompassed the marshy delta where the Great River fanned out before meeting the Mediterranean. These weren't just administrative regions. They were distinct cultural entities with their own traditions, dialects, and even crowns. The white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt symbolized this duality. Therefore, when pharaohs wore the combined double crown, they were making a political statement about unity that often didn't match reality on the ground. The famous Narmer palette, dating to around 3100 BCE, depicts King Narmer, whom many historians identify as the legendary unifier Menes, smiting his enemies and bringing the two lands together. But historians still argue whether this unification was a single dramatic event or a gradual process spanning generations. Either way, the symbolic joining of these two regions never fully erased their underlying differences. It's rather like modern couples who decide to merge their bank accounts after marriage. Sure, on paper it's all "what's mine is yours." But just wait until one spouse blows the vacation fund on a limited edition collection of cat-shaped pottery vessels. Suddenly, those unified finances don't seem so unified anymore. Ancient Egypt was dealing with essentially the same problem, just with more crocodiles and significantly better eyeliner. Geographic realities reinforced these divisions. The Nile itself served as both lifeline and highway, but travel and communication remained slow. Royal decrees took weeks to reach distant provinces. News traveled at the pace of the slowest boat or most tired messenger. This meant that local governors, called nomarchs, often operated with considerable autonomy. They collected taxes, maintained order, and administered justice in the pharaoh's name, but their first loyalty frequently lay with their own provinces and families. One particularly quirky aspect of this arrangement was the nome system. Egypt was divided into 42 nomes or provinces, 22 in Upper Egypt and 20 in Lower Egypt, each with its own totem animal and patron deity. The people of the Oryx nome, for instance, identified with the graceful antelope and worshipped the god Nemti, while neighboring Ibis nome residents rallied behind their sacred bird and the wisdom god Thoth. These regional identities ran deep. Imagine the modern equivalent of neighboring counties going to war because one worships cats and the other prefers dogs. Actually, that doesn't sound entirely implausible even today, does it? This patchwork of regional loyalties created a permanent underlying tension. The pharaoh's authority depended on maintaining a delicate balance of power. Too much centralization and the nomarchs might rebel. Too little and the kingdom could fragment. The pharaoh was like a dinner party host trying to manage a table full of guests with strong opinions and sharper knives. One wrong move and the evening could end in disaster. Resource competition added fuel to this smoldering fire. Despite the Nile's abundance, Egypt was fundamentally a narrow strip of fertile land surrounded by harsh desert. When the annual flood fell short, as it periodically did, food became scarce. Provincial governors hoarded grain for their own people. Therefore, disputes over resources quickly escalated into outright hostility. During particularly bad years, armed bands from less fortunate provinces raided the storehouses of their more fortunate neighbors. The veneer of national unity peeled away to reveal the bare-knuckled fight for survival beneath. Religion, rather than unifying the two lands, sometimes exacerbated these divisions. While all Egyptians shared certain fundamental beliefs, regional cult centers promoted their own deities. The priests of Amun at Thebes, the priests of Ra at Heliopolis, and the priests of Ptah at Memphis all competed for royal favor and funding. These weren't just theological disagreements, they were power struggles with very real political and economic consequences. During the New Kingdom period, the cult of Amun grew so wealthy and influential that its priests nearly rivaled the pharaoh himself. One study estimates that the Temple of Amun controlled approximately 30% of Egypt's cultivable land. That's like a modern church owning a third of all the farmland in your country. Imagine the Vatican controlling most of Italy's pasta production. The power implications would be enormous, and the Sunday potlucks would be absolutely divine. But perhaps the most dangerous fault line in Egyptian society ran through the royal family itself. The pharaoh's household was a nest of competing ambitions: multiple wives, scores of children, ambitious courtiers, and cunning advisors, all jostled for position in a high-stakes game where the prize was nothing less than the throne of Egypt. With no clear rules of succession, the death of a pharaoh often triggered a scramble for power that could tear the kingdom apart. We see this dynamic played out in a remarkable papyrus from the reign of Ramesses III, which details a harem conspiracy led by a secondary queen who sought to place her son on the throne instead of the designated heir. The plotters were discovered, tried, and punished, but the document makes clear that such intrigues were a constant threat. The royal court was less walk like an Egyptian and more backstab like a Borgia. The concept of Ma'at, cosmic order, balance, and justice, stood at the heart of Egyptian religion and governance. Pharaohs were expected to maintain Ma'at through their rule, but this ideal often clashed with the messy reality of Egyptian politics. A fascinating inscription from the tomb of a Middle Kingdom official named Khnumhotep II at Beni Hassan reveals the gap between ideology and practice. While praising his pharaoh for upholding Ma'at, Khnumhotep simultaneously boasts about expanding his own family's power at the expense of rival nobles. Even as he invoked cosmic harmony, he was quietly tipping the scales in his favor. It's rather like those modern CEOs who give inspiring speeches about company values right before announcing massive layoffs. Some things about human nature never really change, whether you're wearing a power suit or a pleated linen kilt. The seeds of civil conflict were thus present even in Egypt's most peaceful and prosperous eras. Unity was never a given. It was an achievement that required constant maintenance. The pharaoh's power depended not just on divine right, but on practical politics, balancing competing interests, managing powerful elites, and ensuring that the benefits of Egyptian civilization were distributed widely enough to prevent revolt. So the next time you gaze upon those serene, majestic monuments of ancient Egypt, remember that beneath their eternal stone facades lay a society perpetually negotiating its own internal tensions. The pyramids and temples weren't just expressions of religious devotion or royal ego. They were also statements of political power, attempts to create through stone and symbol the unity that was so elusive in reality. For all its outward stability, ancient Egypt was built upon foundations as shifting as the desert sands. Foundations that, when conditions were right, could crumble with devastating speed, plunging the two lands into the chaos and bloodshed of civil war. Imagine waking one morning to find the eternal pillars of your world beginning to crack. The pharaoh, living embodiment of the gods, fails to protect the land. The Nile, source of all life, betrays you with floods too small or too large. The priests, interpreters of divine will, fall silent or contradict each other. This was the nightmare that unfolded as Egypt's old kingdom, builder of the Great Pyramids and apparent model of stability, began to crumble around 2180 BCE, plunging the two lands into what historians call the First Intermediate Period. For nearly 1,000 years, the pharaohs of the Old Kingdom had ruled a unified Egypt. They built monuments that still leave us breathless today. They established administrative systems of remarkable sophistication. They created artistic traditions of timeless beauty. But beneath this glittering facade, cracks were forming. The central government gradually weakened under the Sixth Dynasty, while provincial governors grew increasingly independent. Royal authority stretched thin. Therefore, when crisis struck, the entire system collapsed like a poorly designed pyramid scheme. And unlike modern pyramid schemes, they couldn't blame it all on essential oils and leggings with questionable patterns. The immediate trigger appears to have been environmental catastrophe. Analysis of lake sediment cores and Nile flood records reveals evidence of a severe drought lasting decades. The annual flood, upon which Egyptian agriculture entirely depended, repeatedly failed. Fields dried up, crops withered in the relentless sun, famine stalked the land. A fascinating inscription from the tomb of a provincial governor named Anktifi at Mo'ala boasts, all of Upper Egypt was dying of hunger, to such a degree that everyone had come to eating their children. Now, this is likely an exaggeration. Ancient Egyptian texts had a flair for the dramatic that would make modern tabloids blush. But archaeological evidence does confirm widespread malnutrition during this period. Historians still argue whether climate change alone caused the collapse or simply accelerated political processes already in motion. Either way, the consequences were profound. As food grew scarce, central authority evaporated. The mighty pharaonic state, which had seemed as permanent as the stars themselves, revealed itself to be terrifyingly fragile. One particularly quirky aspect of this collapse was the sudden proliferation of men claiming to be pharaoh. During stable periods, Egypt had exactly one ruler, a living god whose authority was absolute and unquestioned. But in the chaos of the first intermediate period, local governors simply declared themselves kings of their own mini-kingdoms. At one point, there may have been as many as 20 pharaohs ruling simultaneously across Egypt. It was like that moment when everyone in your group text declares themselves team captain because nobody can agree on where to go for dinner, except with more ceremonial maces and fewer pizza emojis. The nomarchs, those provincial governors who had once served the pharaoh, now behaved like independent warlords. They raised their own armies, collected their own taxes, and conducted their own foreign policy. Some even adopted royal titles and imagery previously reserved for pharaohs alone. These regional strongmen built fortified residences and surrounded themselves with loyal retainers, creating miniature courts that mimicked the splendor of the old royal capital. In the north, the former royal capital of Memphis fell under the control of kings, claiming legitimacy as the 7th and 8th dynasties, but their real power extended barely beyond the city walls. Meanwhile, a rival power center emerged at Heracleopolis in Middle Egypt, where rulers of the 9th and 10th dynasties controlled the strategic middle section of the Nile. Far to the south, the nomarchs of Thebes grew increasingly powerful, eventually proclaiming themselves the 11th dynasty and beginning a campaign to reunify the country under their rule. For ordinary Egyptians, this fragmentation brought both dangers and opportunities. The collapse of central authority meant the breakdown of the elaborate administrative systems that had governed daily life. No longer could they appeal to royal officials when local nobles abused their power. Tax collection became erratic and often predatory. Irrigation works, which required coordination across provincial boundaries, fell into disrepair. But the absence of the heavy hand of the state also created space for new social mobility. Tomb inscriptions from this period reveal men of humble origins rising to positions of influence that would have been closed to them in the rigid hierarchy of the Old Kingdom. Think of it as ancient Egypt's version of a startup culture. When traditional institutions fail, sometimes the guy who was fetching papyrus scrolls yesterday can become CEO tomorrow. Though I imagine their version of a disruptive business model involved fewer apps and more spears. Let me tell you about Maribre Keti, better known as King Keti III of the 10th dynasty. Before the collapse, he was reportedly just a modest boat captain from Asyut. But as central authority crumbled, he managed to seize control of his home province and eventually claim the throne at Heracleopolis. His rags to riches, or should I say reeds to regalia, story would have been impossible in the stable Old Kingdom, where royal power passed strictly within the divine bloodline. For merchants and traders, the political fragmentation created both challenges and opportunities. Trade routes became dangerous as different territories imposed their own tolls and regulations. But shrewd operators who could navigate these complexities found ways to profit from the situation. Imagine trying to run an Amazon delivery service where you need different permits for every neighborhood and might get your cargo confiscated at any checkpoint. Yet somehow, goods still flowed: copper from Sinai, gold from Nubia, cedar from Lebanon, though at higher prices and with greater risks. One of the most fascinating aspects of this period is how Egyptians themselves made sense of the chaos engulfing their world. The concept of Ma'at, cosmic order and justice, was central to Egyptian thought. The pharaoh's primary duty was to maintain Ma'at against the forces of chaos, known as Isfet. The collapse of royal authority therefore represented not just a political crisis, but a cosmic one. As provincial warlords fought each other, as famine ravaged the land, many Egyptians must have wondered if the gods themselves had abandoned them. This existential crisis produced a remarkable body of literature known as the pessimistic texts. Works like The Admonitions of Ipwe describe a world turned upside down. The land is completely perished, so that no remainder exists. Lo, the face is pale. Lo, great and small say, I wish I were dead. Reading these ancient laments feels strangely familiar in our own era of climate anxiety and political upheaval. Perhaps ancient Egyptians would have understood our modern doom-scrolling all too well, though they had the advantage of not having to worry about their phone battery dying mid-apocalypse. The religious implications were profound. During the stable Old Kingdom, religion focused primarily on the pharaoh as divine intermediary and guarantor of cosmic order. But as royal authority faltered, Egyptians increasingly developed personal relationships with deities, bypassing the failed institution of divine kingship. This shift toward personal piety would have lasting effects on Egyptian religion long after political unity was restored. Consider the hypothetical case of Neferkare, a prosperous merchant from the trading town of Abydos. For generations, his family had conducted business under the protective umbrella of pharaonic authority. Taxes were predictable, contracts enforceable, roads safe. But as the Old Kingdom collapsed, Neferkare found himself navigating a fractured landscape of competing powers. The governor of his province demanded increased taxes to fund his army. Bandits preyed on trade caravans. Former business partners in neighboring provinces now found themselves on opposite sides of shifting political boundaries. When Neferkare's son was conscripted to fight in the nomarch's petty war against a neighboring province, the bitter reality of civil conflict hit home. The young man who left was not fighting foreign enemies, but fellow Egyptians, people who worshipped the same gods, spoke the same language, shared the same cultural heritage. The absurdity and tragedy of Egyptians killing Egyptians represented the ultimate perversion of Ma'at, a cosmic wrongness that seemed to confirm the world had indeed fallen into chaos. So the next time you complain about political dysfunction or economic uncertainty in our modern world, spare a thought for the Egyptians of the first intermediate period. They didn't just face a recession or an unpopular government. They experienced the complete disintegration of a political, social, and religious order that had endured for a millennium. Yet somehow, from this crucible of chaos, Egyptian civilization would eventually emerge renewed, laying the groundwork for the glorious Middle Kingdom to come. Perhaps there's a lesson there for all of us. Even when the center cannot hold, when society itself seems to be collapsing around us, the resilience of the human spirit offers hope that order can eventually be restored from chaos. The bronze tip of a spear catches the desert sun, momentarily blinding before it plunges downward. Egyptian weapons were never designed to kill Egyptians. These elaborately crafted implements of war, with their falcon-headed axes and intricately decorated shields bearing the protective eye of Horus, were meant for foreign enemies, the chaotic outsiders who threatened the ordered world of the two lands. But during civil wars, these sacred instruments of Egyptian military might turn inward, brother against brother, in a perversion of their divine purpose. Combat in ancient Egypt was intimate and personal. Soldiers looked directly into each other's eyes. They heard each other's prayers to the same gods. They smelled each other's fear. The psychological toll of facing enemies who shared your language, your beliefs, and possibly your blood must have been immense. In foreign wars, Egyptian soldiers could comfort themselves with the belief that they fought against the forces of chaos on behalf of cosmic order. But when Egyptian fought Egyptian, who represented Ma'at and who represented Isfet? Both sides invariably claimed divine sanction. Therefore, religious certainty crumbled alongside political unity. The Khopesh, Egypt's iconic curved sword, exemplifies this tragic duality. Originally developed to hook an enemy's shield and pull it away, this weapon became a symbol of Egyptian military prowess during the New Kingdom. Elite soldiers trained from youth to wield these bronze blades with deadly precision. But when civil war erupted, all that expertise and craftsmanship served only to make Egyptians more efficient at killing each other. It's rather like discovering your prize-winning chef brother-in-law has decided to use his culinary skills exclusively to make those disgusting jellied salads from the 1950s. A terrible misapplication of talent, though admittedly with less bloodshed and more suspicious wobbling. Archaeological evidence from mass graves dating to periods of civil conflict tells a grim story. Skeletal remains show distinctive patterns of trauma, crushing blows from maces, clean slices from Khopesh swords, and puncture wounds from spears and arrows. One particularly well-preserved body from a Middle Kingdom battlefield site near Thebes shows multiple defensive wounds on the forearms, a desperate attempt to ward off attacks, before a decisive blow to the skull. These were not quick, clean deaths. They were messy, painful, and terrifying. Historians still argue whether Egyptian civil wars were more or less brutal than their foreign conflicts. Some scholars suggest that shared cultural bonds actually increased the savagery, as each side viewed the other as traitors rather than merely enemies. Others point to evidence of restraint and attempts to limit civilian casualties, particularly in early periods. The truth likely varied widely depending on the specific conflict and the commanders involved. One quirky aspect of Egyptian warfare that became particularly problematic during civil conflicts was the practice of counting enemy hands. After battles, Egyptian soldiers would sever the right hands of fallen enemies and present them to scribes for an official tally. This grisly accounting system determined how much reward each soldier received. But in civil wars, this created a macabre dilemma. Were fellow Egyptians' hands to be counted? Some commanders reportedly prohibited the practice against Egyptian opponents, while others insisted on maintaining it. Imagine the awkward moment when a soldier realized he'd just severed the hand of his wife's cousin from the neighboring province. No amount of makeup gifts could smooth over that particular family rift. The Nile itself became both battlefield and strategic prize during civil conflicts. Control of the river meant control of Egypt's lifeline, its transportation network, its agricultural heartland, its very identity. Military commanders developed specialized tactics for river warfare, using flotillas of shallow draft boats to transport troops and supplies. These weren't grand naval battles with massive ships of the line like you might see in later European warfare. They were fast, chaotic skirmishes with vessels that could navigate the Nile's changeable waters. During the Second Intermediate Period, when northern Egypt fell under Hyksos control while southern Egypt remained independent, the river became the front line in a protracted struggle. The famous Carnarvon tablet describes how the Theban king Kamose used river-based raids to disrupt Hyksos control. I sailed northward to attack the Asiatics. I captured their ships on the river, cattle, goats, and ships laden with cedar wood, incense, fat, honey, and all sorts of pleasant things. Replace cedarwood and incense with PlayStation 5s and toilet paper, and you've basically got the modern equivalent of supply chain warfare. For ordinary Egyptian soldiers, civil war presented unique horrors beyond the physical dangers. In foreign wars, they could dehumanize their enemies, different language, strange gods, alien customs. But in civil conflict, the enemy might be from the next village over. They might recognize faces across the battlefield. They might have traded goods or shared drinks with these very men in peacetime. Now they were expected to kill them in the name of a disputed pharaoh or ambitious nomarch. The psychological burden must have been crushing. Some evidence suggests that desertion rates soared during civil conflicts. A fragmentary papyrus from the First Intermediate Period mentions harsh punishments for soldiers who refused to raise arms against men of their own nomes. The text is damaged, but the prescribed penalty appears to have been impalement, a particularly excruciating death meant to deter others from similar reluctance. Nothing says team spirit quite like threatening to skewer anyone who questions why they're stabbing their neighbors. Foreign mercenaries played a crucial role in Egyptian civil wars, precisely because they lacked these conflicting loyalties. Nubian archers, Libyan spearmen, and later, Sea People's warriors and Greek hoplites could be counted on to fight whoever they were paid to fight. They had no kinship ties to give them pause, no religious qualms about opposing one Egyptian faction over another. Many nomarchs and would-be pharaohs maintained personal bodyguards of foreign fighters, trusting them more than Egyptian troops who might have divided loyalties. During the Third Intermediate Period, Libyan mercenaries became so integral to Egypt's military that they eventually seized power themselves, establishing the 22nd dynasty under Shoshenq I. This would be like if the NFL's security contractors somehow ended up running the United States, though some might argue that large men hitting each other while wearing specialized equipment is already our national pastime. The aftermath of civil war battles brought its own unique horrors. In conflicts with foreigners, Egyptian religious beliefs dictated that the dead should receive proper funerary rites. But in civil wars, the bodies of the rebellious faction were often denied these essential ceremonies. Without proper burial and funerary magic, Egyptians believed the soul could not complete its journey to the afterlife. By denying enemies these rites, victors condemned them to a fate worse than death itself: eternal spiritual oblivion. Imagine surviving soldiers, having just killed their countrymen, then being ordered to leave the bodies to rot in the sun or be consumed by scavengers. The psychological trauma would be compounded by religious terror. For if this could happen to their enemies today, it might happen to them tomorrow. Every Egyptian soldier understood that in civil war, more than just earthly life was at stake. Their eternal soul hung in the balance. The weapons of Egyptian civil war weren't limited to the physical. Psychological warfare played a crucial role, with each side deploying religious and ideological arguments to undermine enemy morale. Royal propaganda portrayed opponents as agents of chaos, enemies of Ma'at, and traitors to Egypt's divine order. Priests performed rituals cursing the opposing side. Commanders exploited regional rivalries and long-standing grievances to motivate their troops. These tactics created deep scars in the collective Egyptian psyche, divisions that often persisted long after the fighting ended. Villages and families that had opposed the eventual victor might face generations of discrimination. The spiritual damage to Egyptian society, the fundamental contradiction of Egyptians using sacred weapons to kill other Egyptians in the name of gods they all shared, could not be easily healed, even after political reunification. One battlefield account, from the struggle between Thebes and Heracleopolis during the First Intermediate Period, describes opposing Egyptian armies pausing before battle to make nearly identical offerings to the same gods, each side praying for victory over the other. The scribe notes, with evident discomfort, "The gods must have turned away their faces, for how could they choose between their children?" So when you look at those gleaming weapons in museum displays, the elegant Kopish swords, the balanced throwing sticks, the finely crafted bows, remember that these instruments of war sometimes turned against their makers. In the terrible crucible of civil conflict, the very tools designed to protect Egyptian civilization became the means of its self-destruction. The bronze that should have guarded Egypt's borders instead pierced Egyptian hearts, leaving wounds in both flesh and spirit that no amount of time could fully heal. A golden mask shatters on the palace floor, fragments scattering like stars across polished limestone. The divine face of the pharaoh, living god and incarnation of Horus, lies broken, profaned by Egyptian hands. No act in ancient Egypt carried greater religious and cultural weight than harming the royal person. The pharaoh wasn't merely a ruler. He was the literal embodiment of divine power on earth, the crucial link between humanity and the gods. His body was sacred, his blood divine. To spill that blood was to tear the very fabric of Ma'at, the cosmic order that sustained all existence. But in times of civil war, even this most inviolable taboo could be broken. The desperate scramble for power overwhelmed religious scruples. Therefore, acts that would have been unthinkable in stable times became horrifyingly common. When ambitious nobles or rival royal family members convinced themselves that they, not the current occupant of the throne, were Egypt's rightful ruler, they could justify almost any action. After all, in their minds, they weren't killing a god. They were removing a usurper who himself had violated Ma'at. The famous judicial papyrus of Turin provides a chilling account of one such violation. The harem conspiracy against Ramesses III in 1155 BCE. The pharaoh's secondary wife, Tie, plotted to assassinate him and place her son Pentaweret on the throne instead of the designated heir. The conspirators recruited palace officials, harem women, and even military officers. They created magical wax figures to overcome the palace guards and planned to attack during the annual Beautiful Feast of the Valley. It was essentially the ancient Egyptian version of a political thriller, though with considerably more eyeliner and fewer car chases. Historians still argue whether the plot succeeded in killing Ramesses III. For decades, scholars believed the conspiracy was discovered before the assassination could be carried out. But recent CT scans of the pharaoh's mummy revealed a deep cut across his throat, hidden by the embalmers beneath layers of bandages and a protective amulet. This suggests the conspirators may have actually succeeded in killing the king, though they failed to install their preferred successor. It seems even the ancient Egyptian equivalent of CSI, Cairo, couldn't fully mask a royal murder when modern technology came calling. The punishment for regicide, killing a king, was uniquely severe in ancient Egypt. The judicial papyrus describes the fate of the conspirators in cold bureaucratic language that makes it all the more chilling. They were examined and they were found guilty. They were left to themselves. They took their own lives. This euphemistic phrasing masks a terrible reality. Many were likely forced to commit suicide, a punishment considered appropriate for those who had committed crimes against the divine order. For Prince Pentaweret, the would-be usurper, even death wasn't punishment enough. A mysterious mummy known as Unknown Man E, discovered in the royal cache at Deir el-Bahari, may be his remains. Unlike other royal mummies, this body wasn't properly embalmed, but instead was wrapped in a sheep's skin, a ritually impure material that would prevent him from entering the afterlife. His face is frozen in a scream, and analysis suggests he may have been buried alive or strangled. Talk about family drama putting your Thanksgiving arguments to shame. Your uncle's political rants over Turkey seem pretty tame compared to royal Egyptian family reunions that ended in forced suicide and eternal damnation. The religious implications of royal assassination were profound. Egyptians believed the pharaoh maintained Ma'at through his very existence. His daily rituals and proper rule kept chaos at bay and ensured the sun would rise, the Nile would flood, and the cosmos would continue functioning. Killing a pharaoh, therefore, wasn't just murder. It was an act that threatened cosmic stability itself. The assassins not only had blood on their hands, they potentially endangered all of Egypt's safety and prosperity. This belief made regicide simultaneously the most tempting and most terrifying act in Egyptian politics. Ambitious nobles who coveted the throne had to convince themselves and their supporters that the current pharaoh was illegitimate or had himself violated Ma'at. Therefore, removing him would actually restore cosmic order rather than disrupt it. This self-justification required elaborate religious and ideological gymnastics that would make modern political spin doctors green with envy. One particularly quirky aspect of royal assassination plots was the crucial role played by magicians and priests. Conspirators often employed magical rituals to weaken the pharaoh's divine protection before attempting physical harm. The Turin judicial papyrus mentions the magic scrolls of the divine abode. which the conspirators used to bypass palace security. These weren't just superstitious gestures. In a culture where magic was considered a real and powerful force, such preparations were deemed as necessary as securing weapons or bribing guards. It's like if modern coup plotters needed both military support and a really good astrologer to ensure Mercury wasn't in retrograde during the takeover. Sorry, we can't overthrow the government today. The stars aren't aligned, and Mercury's doing that thing again. The most dangerous place to be during Egyptian civil wars was, ironically, closest to power. The royal harem, housing the king's secondary wives, concubines, and their children, was a hotbed of intrigue and conspiracy. These women and their offspring had the most to gain from a change in succession and the most intimate access to the king. Numerous assassination attempts originated within palace walls, carried out by those who served the pharaoh's food, attended his bedchamber, or shared his bed. This created a paradoxical situation where pharaohs were most vulnerable in what should have been their safest space. Elaborate security measures evolved in response. Food tasters checked for poison. Royal guards vetted all who entered the king's presence. Sleeping chambers were designed with complex approaches that could be easily monitored. The pharaoh's daily routine became a carefully choreographed security operation disguised as religious ritual. Much like modern celebrities who need security details to protect them from their most obsessive fans, pharaohs required protection from their most ambitious relatives. When royal blood was spilled despite these precautions, the psychological impact on Egyptian society was devastating. The collective trauma of seeing the unthinkable happen, a living god killed by human hands, shattered certainties that had anchored Egyptian culture for centuries. If the divine pharaoh could be murdered, what other cosmic truths might prove false? This existential crisis often prolonged civil conflicts, as various factions struggled to establish new legitimacy in a world where old certainties had crumbled. The Narmer Palette, one of Egypt's earliest royal monuments from around 3100 BCE, shows the unified country's first king smiting his enemies. This iconic image of royal power would be reproduced for 3,000 years. But notably, these enemies are always foreigners or rebels, never rival kings. The ideology of divine kingship simply couldn't accommodate the idea of one legitimate pharaoh fighting another. When such conflicts did occur, they had to be reframed. The victor was always the rightful king, while the vanquished was posthumously delegitimized as a usurper or rebel. This rewriting of history created peculiar situations where a ruler might be recognized as legitimate in one part of Egypt, while being denounced as a usurper in another. During the Third Intermediate Period, rival dynasties ruled simultaneously from Tanis in the north and Thebes in the south, each maintaining their own royal records that ignored or delegitimized the other. This would be like if both Florida and California each insisted they had the only real American president, and both rewrote history books to erase the other. Though given recent political tensions, perhaps that's not as far-fetched an analogy as it should be. When civil conflicts finally ended and unity was restored, the new rulers faced the delicate task of explaining why Egyptian had killed Egyptian, king had fought king, and royal blood had been spilled by royal hands. The answer almost always involved elaborate theological justifications. The victorious pharaoh had been carrying out the will of the gods all along. His defeated opponents had been agents of chaos, not true kings at all. The cosmic order had never actually been broken, merely tested and ultimately reaffirmed. But the Egyptian people, having witnessed the unthinkable, could never fully unhear the sound of that golden mask shattering on the palace floor, a sound that once heard, like divine blood once spilled, could never truly be called back. Two brothers stand at opposite ends of a muddy field, each wearing the colors of rival nomarchs. They've shared everything since childhood: meals, games, secrets, dreams. But today, they will raise weapons against each other. Civil war doesn't just divide kingdoms, it slices through families with surgical precision, forcing impossible choices upon those caught in its path. The intimate tragedy of Egypt's internal conflicts played out not only in grand throne rooms and battlefields, but around humble dinner tables and family hearths throughout the two lands. Consider the fictional but historically plausible family of Nachtmin, a mid-level scribe in the provincial capital of Asyut during the First Intermediate Period. For generations, his family had served the local nomarch, recording tax collections and maintaining administrative records. A comfortable, predictable life. But when central authority collapsed and the nomarch declared independence from Memphis, everything changed. Nachtmin's eldest son, trained in the family profession, remained loyal to the local ruler. But his younger son, who had studied at the royal court in Memphis, sided with the remnants of central authority. Therefore, what was once a proud family now became a house divided. Family ties that had once seemed unbreakable suddenly became political liabilities. Brothers found themselves in opposing armies. Fathers and sons stopped speaking. Cousins reported each other's treasonous comments to rival authorities. The very bonds that formed the bedrock of Egyptian society, family loyalty and ancestral tradition, became weaponized in the struggle for power. It's rather like how modern family group texts can instantly transform from sharing baby photos to full-scale political warfare after someone mentions an election. Except in ancient Egypt, unfriending someone meant a bit more than just clicking a button on Facebook. Women in divided families faced particularly complex challenges during civil conflicts. As daughters, wives, and mothers, they often served as potential bridges between competing factions. A strategic marriage could cement a political alliance. A well-placed female relative might facilitate peace negotiations. But this mediating potential also made women targets. In one particularly ruthless episode, during the Second Intermediate Period, a local ruler reportedly took the wives and daughters of his political opponents hostage, effectively using them as human shields against attack. Even by the standards of the time, this was considered dishonorable behavior, a violation of unwritten codes that, somewhat paradoxically, governed how civil wars were conducted. Not all women were passive pawns, however. The historical record reveals numerous examples of Egyptian women who played active roles in civil conflicts, sometimes as peacemakers, but often as instigators and power brokers in their own right. Queen Ahotep I, mother of Pharaoh Ahmose I, received military honors for caring for Egypt. She has looked after her soldiers, she has guarded Egypt, she has brought back her fugitives, and gathered together her deserters. She has pacified Upper Egypt and expelled her rebels. These aren't exactly the accomplishments you'd list on a world's greatest mom coffee mug, though they certainly demonstrate impressive multitasking skills. Historians still argue whether women gained or lost power during periods of civil unrest. Some evidence suggests that the breakdown of traditional authority created opportunities for women to step into roles normally closed to them. Other scholars point to increased vulnerability and exploitation when legal protections collapsed. The truth likely varied widely depending on social class, regional culture, and individual circumstances. What's clear is that women were never merely passive spectators in these conflicts. They made strategic choices and took calculated risks to protect themselves and their families. Perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of divided families was the impact on children. Young Egyptians who had been raised with clear identities and expectations suddenly found their world turned upside down. Imagine a child taught to revere the local nomarch as the legitimate authority, only to have a beloved uncle arrive from another province declaring this same ruler a traitor to the true pharaoh. The psychological confusion must have been immense. Children caught in these contradictions often became pawns themselves, sent to live with relatives on one side or the other, effectively serving as hostages to ensure family loyalty. One quirky but revealing aspect of how civil conflict affected families appears in changes to naming patterns during these periods. Analysis of names from stable eras shows many Egyptians proudly naming children after the reigning pharaoh, or including the names of state gods like Amun or Ra. During civil wars, these politically charged names become noticeably less common. Instead, we see a rise in names invoking protective household deities or simple nature elements, a linguistic strategy to avoid declaring political allegiance through one's children. It would be like modern parents avoiding names like Kennedy or Reagan during a particularly divisive election year and sticking with river or sky instead, though I suspect ancient Egyptians would have drawn the line at naming kids Apple or Northwest. The destruction of family tombs and ancestral worship sites represents another devastating dimension of civil conflict. For Egyptians, proper veneration of ancestors was a sacred duty. The family tomb wasn't merely a burial place, but a spiritual home where generations remained connected through ritual offerings and prayers. When rival factions targeted these sites for destruction or desecration, they struck at the very foundation of family identity. Inscription fragments from the First Intermediate Period lament enemies who made the ancestors homeless by destroying family chapels, a spiritual crime considered almost as severe as physical violence against the living. Long-lasting feuds often outlived the original conflicts that spawned them. Even after political unity was restored, families that had chosen opposite sides might continue their private Cold Wars for generations. Property disputes, inheritance claims, and local political rivalries became proxies for the larger conflict, keeping old wounds fresh long after the broader civil war had ended. Egyptian wisdom literature from periods following civil strife often includes warnings about the dangers of holding grudges and the importance of reconciliation, evidence that these lingering family divisions were recognized as threats to stability. Yet remarkably, there are also accounts of reconciliation and forgiveness. A fragmentary papyrus from the Middle Kingdom describes two brothers who fought on opposite sides during the reunification wars, only to reconcile years later when one saved the other from drowning in a canal. "The waters washed away our quarrel," the text poetically states, "and we emerged as brothers once more." Whether this represents an actual event or a cultural ideal is unclear, but it reflects a recognition that healing divided families was essential to healing the divided kingdom. For many families, these reconciliations came too late. Civil wars created generations of orphans, widows, and broken family lines. The biographical inscription of Ankh-Tifi, a nomarch during the First Intermediate Period, boasts that he provided for the widow who had been with a husband and for the girl who had been with no husband. Behind this seemingly benevolent claim lies a grim reality. So many men had died in the conflicts that large numbers of women had lost their traditional economic support and protection. The emotional toll of these divided loyalties is harder to quantify, but no less significant. Egyptian art and literature place enormous emphasis on family harmony and proper relationships between generations. Civil conflicts forced impossible choices that violated these cultural ideals. To choose king over father, province over brother, or ambition over family peace was to place oneself outside the bounds of Ma'at, cosmic order and justice. The psychological burden of such choices must have been crushing. Consider again our fictional brothers on that muddy battlefield. Whatever happens next, something precious has already been lost. If they fight, one may kill the other, an unthinkable act of family violence. If one refuses to fight, he betrays his political oath and risks punishment as a traitor. If both walk away, they condemn their comrades and potentially their wider families to defeat. There is no choice without terrible consequences, the definition of true tragedy. The survival strategies families developed to navigate these impossible situations reveal much about human resilience. Some families deliberately split their loyalties, placing members in both camps as a form of political insurance. Others retreated from public life entirely, seeking safety in obscurity. The wealthiest might flee to neighboring lands until the conflict resolved. The poorest simply endured, keeping their heads down and their opinions private. These weren't just practical tactics, but psychological coping mechanisms for maintaining some sense of agency in a world spinning out of control. Through all these strategies runs a common thread: the desperate attempt to preserve what matters most when everything else falls apart. For beyond political allegiance, beyond religious conviction, beyond even survival itself, the bonds of family represented something eternal in the Egyptian worldview, something worth fighting for, worth suffering for, and ultimately, worth reconciling for. So when we examine the grand sweep of Egyptian civil wars, the battling pharaohs, the theological disputes, the shifting borders and political realignments, let us not forget the quiet tragedy of that dinner table where a father stares at his son's empty chair, wondering if they will ever break bread together again. For in that silent space between heartbeats lies the true cost of civil war. A cost measured not in territories lost or dynasties fallen, but in the sacred bonds of family stretched until they finally, painfully break. A child's hand reaches into an empty grain jar, fingers scraping desperately against pottery. Famine stalks the land. In the shadow of clashing armies and royal power struggles, quieter but more lethal forces claimed countless Egyptian lives during civil wars. While bronze weapons took their toll on the battlefield, hunger and disease proved far more merciless killers, decimating civilian populations caught in the crossfire of competing ambitions. These silent predators didn't discriminate between royalist or rebel, noble or commoner. They devoured all with equal indifference. Egypt's entire civilization depended on a single, magnificent lifeline: the Nile and its annual flood. This predictable inundation transformed an otherwise harsh desert landscape into one of the ancient world's most productive agricultural regions. But civil war disrupted the delicate human systems that harnessed this natural bounty. Irrigation channels required constant maintenance. Therefore, when conflict diverted labor and resources away from this essential work, the entire agricultural system began to falter. Fields dried up, crops withered, and the specter of starvation loomed large. Perhaps the cruelest aspect of civil war famine was its fundamentally artificial nature. The Nile continued to flow. The land remained fertile. The knowledge of farming techniques wasn't lost. But the social and political structures that organized labor, distributed resources, and maintained infrastructure collapsed under the weight of conflict. Nature provided abundance, but human violence prevented its harvest and distribution. It's rather like having a fully stocked refrigerator during a power outage. The food is right there, but you still go hungry watching it spoil. During the first intermediate period, grave inscriptions tell a grim tale of agricultural breakdown. A nomarch named Anktifi boasted, "I gave bread to the hungry and clothing to the naked." The whole land had become like locusts going upstream and downstream in search of food. This wasn't merely political propaganda. Skeletal remains from this period show telltale signs of malnutrition, including stress lines in teeth enamel and stunted growth patterns. The archaeological evidence confirms what the texts suggest: widespread, devastating hunger. Grain storage facilities became prime military targets during civil conflicts. These weren't simply warehouses, but the ancient equivalent of strategic oil reserves or federal gold depositories. Control them, and you controlled the population's very survival. Rival factions raided these vital stockpiles, sometimes destroying what they couldn't carry to deny resources to their enemies. Imagine someone burning down a Costco warehouse during a supply chain crisis, just to spite their political opponents, and you'll grasp the devastating impact of these tactics on civilian populations. One particularly quirky but revealing aspect of this food insecurity appears in changes to ancient Egyptian burial practices during periods of civil strife. In stable eras, tombs typically contained abundant food offerings and detailed shopping lists of provisions for the afterlife. During civil war periods, these offerings became noticeably more modest, and some tombs contain apologetic inscriptions explaining that better offerings would have been provided if not for the troubles of the time. Even in death, the effects of civil war famine couldn't be escaped. It seems the ancient Egyptians had to implement afterlife austerity measures, spiritual ramen noodles instead of the usual 5-star divine catering service. The desperate search for food drove people to extremes. Paleopathological evidence from certain first intermediate period sites shows unusual wear patterns on human teeth consistent with consuming large quantities of tough plant materials, not normally part of the Egyptian diet. Desert plants, tree bark, and even papyrus reeds. One excavation uncovered the remains of cats, dogs, and other animals not typically eaten by Egyptians, with cut marks suggesting they were butchered for food. Hunger rewrote cultural taboos with brutal efficiency. Historians still argue whether these famines were directly caused by civil conflicts, or whether environmental factors like drought played the primary role, with political instability merely exacerbating natural challenges. The evidence suggests a complex interplay between environmental stress and human systems, each making the other worse in a devastating feedback loop. Disease followed closely in famine's footsteps, finding fertile ground in weakened populations. The breakdown of sanitation systems in crowded cities and refugee camps created perfect conditions for epidemics. Ancient Egyptian medical papyri describe symptoms consistent with dysentery, typhoid, and various parasitic infections, all of which would have spread rapidly in the unsanitary conditions of wartime. Without effective treatments, these diseases cut through vulnerable populations like a scythe through wheat. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the world's oldest medical texts, contains treatments for numerous intestinal parasites and diarrheal diseases, afflictions that would have exploded during civil conflicts when clean water became scarce and sanitation collapsed. Some of the recommended treatments, like pomegranate root extract for intestinal worms, actually contained effective natural antiparasitic compounds. Others, like reciting magical spells while consuming mouse tails, probably had a somewhat less impressive success rate. Egyptian medicine was surprisingly advanced for its time, but still woefully inadequate against the disease tsunamis that civil wars unleashed. Refugee movements inadvertently accelerated disease transmission. As people fled conflict zones, they carried pathogens to new areas, exposing previously unaffected populations. These refugees often congregated in makeshift camps where overcrowding and poor sanitation created ideal conditions for contagion. One fragmentary text from the Second Intermediate Period describes the sickness that travels with the displaced, suggesting ancient Egyptians recognized the connection between population movements and disease spread. They understood epidemiology better than some modern anti-maskers, though admittedly, they lacked the advantage of sharing their misinformation via YouTube conspiracy videos. The young and elderly suffered most severely from these twin scourges. Children, with their developing immune systems and higher nutritional needs, proved particularly vulnerable. Excavations of mass graves from periods of civil conflict revealed disproportionate numbers of remains from these age groups. One particularly heartbreaking find from a first intermediate period cemetery near Abydos uncovered the remains of multiple children buried with simple clay figurines, humble toys accompanying them into the afterlife, poignant reminders of lives cut tragically short. For the elderly, civil war often meant abandonment. In stable times, Egyptian culture placed great emphasis on caring for aging parents and grandparents. Religious texts like the Instructions of Ptahhotep explicitly commanded proper treatment of the elderly as a sacred duty. But when families were forced to flee or faced extreme resource scarcity, the old and infirm sometimes had to be left behind. Tomb inscriptions occasionally reference this painful reality, with elderly officials expressing gratitude when children managed to provide proper burial despite the chaos of the times. The bitter irony of famine striking Egypt wasn't lost on ancient observers. The Nile Valley was renowned throughout the ancient world for its agricultural abundance. Egypt was the breadbasket of the Mediterranean, exporting grain even during lean years elsewhere. For such a naturally fertile land to experience starvation represented a profound perversion of the natural order. It would be like Switzerland running out of chocolate, or Seattle facing a coffee shortage, a situation so contrary to the normal state of affairs that it could only be explained as divine punishment or cosmic disorder. This perception fed into religious interpretations of civil conflict. The concept of Ma'at, cosmic order and justice, was central to Egyptian thought. Famine and disease weren't merely physical calamities, but spiritual signs that Ma'at had been violated. This created a theological crisis, as Egyptians struggled to understand why their gods would allow such suffering. Some texts from these periods question divine justice in ways that would have been unthinkable during stable eras, showing how profoundly these experiences shook religious certainty. Archaeological evidence of mass graves tells the statistical story of these silent killers. A notable example comes from a site near Tel El Daba in the eastern delta, where excavations revealed multiple mass burials dating to the Second Intermediate Period. Unlike battle casualties, which typically show trauma marks on the bones, many of these remains bear the hallmarks of malnutrition and disease, evidence of anemia, growth interruptions, and chronic infections. These weren't warriors who died gloriously in battle, but ordinary people, farmers, craftsmen, children, mothers, who wasted away as civil war destroyed the systems that sustained their lives. The pharaohs and generals who launched civil wars rarely numbered these invisible casualties among their calculations. Royal inscriptions boast of enemies defeated and territories conquered, but remain silent about the commoners who starved while armies trampled their fields, or the children carried away by diseases that spread in the conflict's wake. This silence persists even in modern discussions of ancient warfare, which often focus on battles and politics while overlooking the pandemic suffering of ordinary people. So when we contemplate the true brutality of ancient Egyptian civil wars, we should look beyond the battlefield to the empty granaries, the abandoned irrigation channels, and the mass graves of the unnamed. For while swords and arrows claimed hundreds, hunger and disease took thousands. A grim reminder that in civil conflict, the most devastating weapons are often not those that make the loudest noise, but those that kill in quiet, desperate silence. The gleaming white walls of Thebes, once symbols of prosperity and divine protection, now bristle with hastily erected wooden barricades. Archers crouch behind makeshift battlements, eyes scanning the horizon for approaching enemies. Below, narrow streets that once hummed with commerce and conversation have fallen eerily silent. This is the transformed face of an Egyptian city under siege, a place where the rhythms of normal life yield to the harsh cadence of survival. Cities represented the pinnacle of Egyptian civilization, centers of commerce, religion, and administration, where the sophisticated machinery of state functioned most visibly. But during civil wars, these urban jewels became prime military targets, their concentrated resources and symbolic importance making them irresistible prizes. The very features that made cities thrive in peacetime, dense populations, centralized food storage, dependence on external supply lines, became deadly vulnerabilities when conflict erupted. The walls that defined urban spaces, originally built to control trade and tax collection, suddenly needed to serve as genuine military defenses against fellow Egyptians. Most Egyptian cities weren't designed with serious military defense in mind. Therefore, when civil conflict erupted, frantic modifications transformed the urban landscape. Archaeological evidence from sites like Tel El Daba and Elephantine shows how peaceful administrative centers hastily converted into fortresses. Elegant gateways narrowed to create defensive bottlenecks. Mud brick reinforcements strengthened vulnerable walls. Moats appeared where decorative water features once stood. The entire architectural vocabulary of the city changed almost overnight, reflecting the new reality of neighbors turned enemies. Imagine the scene at Memphis during the First Intermediate Period, as the once mighty capital of a unified Egypt prepared for attack. Workers stripped fine limestone from temples and palaces to strengthen defensive walls. Statues of gods and kings, previously displayed in open courtyards, disappeared into hidden storerooms for protection. Markets emptied as merchants fled or converted their shops into barracks. The city's famous gardens, once meticulously maintained to showcase Egypt's agricultural bounty, were replanted with quick-growing, calorie-dense crops to sustain the population during a potential siege. It's rather like watching your elegant dining room being converted into a panic room, the chandelier replaced with emergency lighting, the the fine china stashed away for metal plates, and your carefully curated wine collection suddenly valued only for its caloric content rather than its bouquet. Though I imagine even siege-threatened Egyptians would have drawn the line at drinking cooking wine. Daily life behind these hastily fortified walls became a study in deprivation and adaptation. Water access proved particularly crucial. Most Egyptian cities relied on the Nile or canals for their water supply, systems easily contaminated or cut off by besieging forces. Excavations at several urban sites reveal how residents dug emergency wells within city walls during conflict periods, sometimes reaching depths of over 30 meters to tap groundwater. One particularly ingenious example from Avaris shows evidence of a secret tunnel leading to the Nile, allowing besieged residents to collect water under cover of darkness without exposing themselves to enemy archers. These ancient Egyptians would have excelled at escape room challenges, though the stakes were considerably higher than just bragging rights and a group photo on the Wall of Fame. Sanitation systems quickly collapsed under siege conditions. Examination of archaeological layers corresponding to Civil War periods shows unusual concentrations of household waste within city limits, evidence that normal disposal practices broke down. Streets narrowed as garbage accumulated along walls. Cesspits overflowed. The stench must have been overwhelming in the desert heat. A fragmentary medical papyrus from the Second Intermediate Period lists treatments for the sicknesses of the besieged city, including various intestinal ailments that likely resulted from deteriorating hygiene conditions. Ancient Egyptian pharmacopoeia included some genuinely effective antimicrobial substances like honey and garlic. But even these remedies would have been overwhelmed by the public health catastrophe of a city under prolonged siege. Food distribution systems underwent radical transformation. In peacetime, Egyptian cities operated efficient markets where various goods flowed freely. During sieges, these systems gave way to strict rationing under government control. The Semna Dispatches, a collection of military correspondence from a fortified settlement in Nubia, detail elaborate accounting systems for monitoring and distributing food supplies during times of crisis. Bread and beer, staples of the Egyptian diet, were carefully measured out according to rank and occupation. Soldiers and laborers engaged in defense work received larger portions than ordinary civilians. Children and the elderly often received reduced rations, a brutal calculus of survival that prioritized those deemed most useful to the city's defense. Historians still argue whether these urban siege experiences fostered greater social cohesion or exacerbated existing inequalities. Some evidence suggests that shared hardship broke down normal social barriers, with nobles and commoners joining forces in common defense. Other sources indicate that privilege persisted or even intensified, with elites hoarding resources while ordinary citizens suffered. The reality likely varied from city to city and siege to siege, reflecting the personalities of local leaders and the severity of the crisis. One particularly quirky aspect of siege life appears in changes to religious practices. Normal Egyptian worship involved elaborate temple rituals performed by professional priests, often requiring specific ingredients and equipment. When cities came under siege, these formal practices gave way to impromptu household worship, using whatever materials remained available. Archaeological evidence shows a proliferation of crude homemade amulets and votive figures during conflict periods. Desperate citizens fashioning religious objects from broken pottery, scrap wood, and even food clay when proper materials couldn't be obtained. It's the ancient equivalent of making do, like crafting a birthday cake from stale bread and ketchup when you can't get to the store. Sorry, Bastet, I know you prefer proper alabaster statues, but how about this cat-shaped lump I made from some old lentils? We're in a siege, so work with me here. The psychological impact of siege warfare on city dwellers was profound. Egyptian culture placed enormous value on order, predictability, and cosmic harmony. The chaotic conditions of a besieged city represented the antithesis of these ideals, a manifestation of Isfet, chaos, triumphing over Ma'at, order. Tomb inscriptions from these periods sometimes describe the emotional and spiritual distress of living under such conditions, with one Middle Kingdom official lamenting how the noise of battle replaced the songs of celebration and fear walked the streets where joy once dwelled. The sensory assault was relentless. The constant vigilance, disrupted sleep, unfamiliar military commands echoing through normally peaceful neighborhoods. Desperate measures became commonplace as sieges dragged on. Evidence from Tel el-Dabba suggests that during one particularly prolonged siege, residents began dismantling interior wooden structures, furniture, roof beams, even sacred objects for cooking fuel. At another site, archaeologists discovered human remains in what appears to be a tannery, suggesting the gruesome possibility that leather production continued using the skins of the deceased when animal supplies ran out. This macabre recycling represents the absolute extremity of siege conditions, where normal taboos dissolved in the face of collective survival needs. I'd offer a joke here, but even my dark humor has its limits. Though I suspect ancient Egyptians developed a particularly grim siege gallows humor that would make modern disaster jokes look positively tame. The fate of captured cities varied dramatically. Some conquering forces showed mercy, recognizing the value of intact urban infrastructure and skilled populations. Others engaged in systematic destruction, razing buildings and scattering inhabitants as punishment for resistance. Archaeological evidence tells both stories. Layers of careful rebuilding atop minimal destruction in some sites, complete abandonment following catastrophic damage in others. The excavations at Avaris show at least 7 major destruction layers, followed by rebuilding phases, testament to the city's strategic importance and resilience despite repeated devastation. Physical evidence of these siege cycles appears in city stratigraphy, the layers of construction, destruction, and rebuilding that accumulate over centuries. Archaeologists can identify distinct burn layers, marking episodes of violence, often followed by hasty reconstruction using salvaged materials. These physical scars in the urban landscape mirror the psychological and social trauma experienced by residents. At some sites, religious structures show evidence of particular targeting. Temples defaced, divine statues decapitated, sacred spaces deliberately desecrated. These weren't just military actions, but attempts to break the spiritual backbone of resistance. When sieges finally ended, whether through surrender, successful defense, or negotiated settlement, cities faced the daunting task of rebuilding. Physical reconstruction was just the beginning. Returning refugees had to be reintegrated. Property disputes between those who fled and those who stayed required resolution. The social fabric, torn by divided loyalties during the conflict, needed careful mending. Some cities never fully recovered their former glory. Others emerged stronger, their inhabitants bound together by shared survival of the ordeal. So the next time you find yourself frustrated by minor urban inconveniences, a traffic jam, a brief power outage, construction noise, spare a thought for the citizens of ancient Egyptian cities under siege. Their experience reminds us that the cities we build, for all their apparent permanence and solidity, remain fundamentally fragile creations, their true strength residing not in walls and buildings, but in the resilience of those who call them home. The magnificent statue of Amun-Ra crashes to the temple floor, its head severing from the body with a sickening crack. Priests wail as soldiers systematically deface sacred hieroglyphs, chiseling away the names of deities now deemed enemies of the state. When Egyptians went to war with each other, their gods inevitably joined the fray. Civil conflict wasn't merely a struggle for political power or territory. It represented a cosmic battle for divine favor and religious legitimacy. The spiritual dimension of these wars often proved more lasting and traumatic than their physical manifestations. Egyptian religion wasn't just one aspect of culture, it permeated every facet of existence. The pharaoh himself served as the crucial intermediary between humanity and the divine, responsible for maintaining ma'at, cosmic order and justice, through proper ritual and rule. But civil wars created an impossible theological contradiction. two or more competing pharaohs, each claimed exclusive divine sanction. Therefore, ordinary Egyptians faced a crisis of faith alongside the physical dangers of conflict. How could the gods speak with multiple voices? Which claimant truly represented divine will? These weren't abstract theological questions, but urgent practical concerns with life or death consequences. Rival factions employed elaborate religious propaganda to bolster their legitimacy. The famous Dream Stela of Thutmose IV exemplifies this approach. According to this inscription, the god Harmakhis, a form of Horus, appeared to Thutmose in a dream while he rested between the paws of the Sphinx, promising him the throne if he cleared away the sand burying the monument. This convenient divine endorsement helped justify Thutmose's somewhat questionable claim to power. It's the ancient Egyptian equivalent of claiming God told you to run for president because you found his face on your morning toast. Except people actually believed it, and the resulting monument has lasted millennia rather than becoming moldy breakfast. Priests faced particularly wrenching choices during civil conflicts. As spiritual leaders and keepers of religious knowledge, they wielded enormous influence. Their endorsement could legitimize a ruler's claim. Their opposition could undermine it. But this political power made them targets. A temple might find itself caught between competing factions, each demanding declarations of divine support for their cause. Choosing wrongly could mean destruction of the temple and death of its priests. Staying neutral rarely remained an option. It's rather like being the only registered voter in a swing state during a neck-and-neck election. Suddenly everyone wants your endorsement, and "I'd rather not get involved" isn't going to cut it as a response. The theological crisis extended beyond practical politics to the very foundations of Egyptian religious thought. How could the gods allow Egyptians to slaughter each other in their names? Why hadn't divine intervention prevented such chaos? One remarkable text from the First Intermediate Period, known as the Admonitions of Ipuwer, directly questions divine justice. Lo, why does the god Re permit people to slay their brother? Why does he permit fear to stalk the land? Such direct theological questioning would have been unthinkable in more stable periods, when divine order seemed self-evident. Desecration of temples and sacred objects became a standard tactic of psychological warfare. By attacking an enemy's gods, you struck at their cosmic security and group identity. The Victory Stela of King Pi from the 25th dynasty describes how the conquering Nubian ruler refused to enter certain Egyptian temples because they had been polluted by his enemies. Instead, he ordered purification rituals before he would set foot inside. This suggests that the deliberate defiling of sacred spaces was a recognized aspect of civil conflict, a way to wound enemy morale at its deepest level. One particularly quirky manifestation of religious warfare appears in what Egyptologists call execration texts, ritual curses inscribed on pottery, figurines, or tablets, and then ceremonially destroyed to magically harm enemies. During periods of internal conflict, these execration rituals targeted fellow Egyptians rather than traditional foreign enemies. Archaeologists have discovered caches of these objects bearing the names of rival Egyptian factions, evidence of magical warfare conducted alongside physical battles. Imagine if modern political campaigns didn't just run attack ads, but also hired witches to cast spells on their opponents. Though given the state of modern politics, perhaps we're not as far from execration texts as we might think. The trauma of seeing sacred images and spaces violated often outlasted the physical damage. Egyptian religion centered on the power of images. Statues weren't merely representations of gods, but vessels in which divine power could dwell. Defacing or destroying these images constituted an attack on the gods themselves. Witnessing such sacrilege could inflict profound psychological wounds on believers. One New Kingdom text describes people weeping as if their own children had been slaughtered when seeing damaged divine statues, evidence of the deep emotional bond Egyptians felt with their religious imagery. Religious innovations and adaptations emerged from these traumatic periods. As institutional religion faltered amid civil strife, personal piety often flourished. Archaeological evidence shows a proliferation of household shrines and private religious artifacts during and immediately after periods of civil conflict. Unable to rely on temple ceremonies disrupted by war, ordinary Egyptians developed more direct relationships with their deities. Historians still argue whether this shift toward personal religious practice represented a genuine theological evolution or merely a practical adaptation to circumstances. Either way, it marked a significant change in how Egyptians related to their gods. This rise in personal piety manifests most clearly in letters to the dead and private votive offerings that increased dramatically during unstable periods. These humble artifacts, often crudely made compared to official temple goods, reveal ordinary people bypassing disrupted religious hierarchies to communicate directly with supernatural forces. One particularly touching example from the Second Intermediate Period shows a simple clay figurine of a seated woman, apparently pregnant, with the roughly scratched inscription, "Taweret, goddess of childbirth, protect us both, though the priests have fled." It's a poignant reminder that even amid cosmic disorder, individual spiritual needs continued. Perhaps the most fascinating religious development during Egyptian civil wars was the phenomenon of refugee gods, deities whose cult centers were destroyed or occupied, forcing their priests to relocate with sacred objects and texts. When Memphis fell during the First Intermediate Period, some priests of Ptah fled south to Thebes, bringing their god with them. This created theological complications when peace returned. Did Ptah now reside primarily in his original home or his adopted one? Should offerings be divided between locations? The ancient Egyptians were essentially dealing with divine custody arrangements after cosmic divorce. Amun gets the god on weekends and holidays, while Ptah maintains primary custody during the school week. Religious texts reflected and processed the trauma of civil war in various ways. The prophecy of Nefertiti, composed during the Middle Kingdom, but set in the troubled times of the Old Kingdom's collapse, uses religious framing to make sense of civil conflict. It portrays the disorder as part of a divine plan, eventually resolved when a savior king restores Ma'at. By retroactively imposing cosmic meaning on chaotic events, such texts helped Egyptians integrate the traumatic experience of civil war into their religious worldview. We do something similar today with our disaster movies and apocalyptic fiction. They're not just entertainment, but ways of mentally rehearsing and processing our deepest societal fears. The restoration of temples and religious ceremonies played a crucial role in post-war reconciliation. Victorious rulers invested enormous resources in repairing or rebuilding damaged sacred structures, often on a grander scale than before. These construction projects served multiple purposes, demonstrating the winner's piety, providing employment for a population recovering from conflict, and symbolically healing the cosmic wounds of civil war. The famous building programs of Amenhotep III and Ramesses II followed periods of internal strife and external threat, using architectural splendor to proclaim that divine order had been restored. These cycles of religious destruction and renewal left permanent marks on Egyptian theology. The concept of divine kingship, so central to Egyptian religious thought, never fully recovered from the contradictions exposed during civil wars. If gods truly selected and protected pharaohs, how could divinely anointed kings be overthrown by rivals making identical claims? The religious reforms of Akhenaten in the 14th century BCE, which temporarily replaced traditional polytheism with worship focused on the Aten, sun disk, may have been partly motivated by the theological problems created by previous civil conflicts. The spiritual dimension of Egyptian civil wars reminds us that ancient conflicts weren't just about territory, resources, or power. They were battles for meaning itself. When temples burned and gods' names were erased, something more profound than physical destruction was occurring. The cosmic order that gave Egyptian society its coherence and purpose seemed to unravel, leaving people adrift in a world suddenly devoid of its organizing principles. Yet from this spiritual devastation emerged new forms of religious expression and understanding, testament to humanity's enduring need to find meaning even amid chaos. So when we look at the serene divine statues in museum displays today, their placid expressions revealing no hint of the tumult they witnessed, remember that these sacred objects once stood at the center of Egypt's most wrenching conflicts. Gods and humans alike were casualties in these wars, and when peace finally returned, the temples that rose from the ashes held within their stones not just the memory of destruction, but the eternal hope that what mortals tear apart, faith can somehow make whole again. A reed pen scratches across papyrus, rewriting history with each careful hieroglyph. In the quiet chambers where scribes labored, far from the clash of weapons, ancient Egypt fought another crucial battle, the war of words. While soldiers wielded bronze on the battlefield, scribes wielded ink in a struggle that would outlast any military campaign. These educated elites didn't just record events, they shaped how those events would be remembered for millennia to come. The victors might win with swords, but scribes ensured they stayed victorious in memory. Literacy in ancient Egypt was exceedingly rare. Estimates suggest less than 1% of the population could read and write. This gave scribes extraordinary power as gatekeepers of information and creators of official narratives. During civil conflicts, competing factions desperately needed these skilled individuals to legitimize their claims and demonize their opponents. A convincing royal inscription or religious text could sway powerful temple priests, provincial governors, and foreign allies to your cause. But scribes had their own interests and safety to consider. Therefore, their loyalties became valuable commodities in the political marketplace of civil war. Many found themselves caught between rival powers, their specialized skills both blessing and curse in such divided times. The scribal class wasn't politically naive. Their education included not just writing techniques but also rhetoric, history, and religious knowledge. They understood propaganda and employed it with sophisticated skill. One famous example is the Instruction of Amenemhat I, purportedly written by a murdered king to his son from beyond the grave. This text, almost certainly composed after the king's assassination, rewrites a palace coup as a tragic mistake, while reinforcing the legitimacy of the successor. It's basically the ancient Egyptian equivalent of a posthumous celebrity tweet that conveniently supports whoever now controls their social media accounts. From the afterlife, I just want to say my successor is doing a great job, much better than I ever did, blessed in the Westland, not bitter at all. Vilification of opponents followed predictable patterns. Rival claimants weren't just political competitors, but cosmic enemies, embodiments of Isfet, chaos, threatening to destroy Ma'at, divine order. They weren't described as fellow Egyptians with legitimate grievances, but as rebels, enemies of the god, or even Asiatics, regardless of their actual ethnicity. This last insult was particularly potent, as it placed internal opponents in the same category as foreign invaders. 1 second intermediate period text describes a rival Egyptian faction as having Asiatic hearts, though they speak the language of Egypt, effectively denying their very identity as Egyptians. Modern political operatives who call opponents un-American or traitors are merely recycling propaganda techniques perfected thousands of years ago by guys in loincloths with really excellent eyeliner. Perhaps the most dramatic propaganda technique was the damnatio memoriae, the complete erasure of a defeated enemy from history. Names and images would be systematically chiseled from monuments, removed from official records, and banned from public mention. This wasn't mere spite, but a theological act with profound implications in Egyptian belief. Without their names and images preserved, the condemned would struggle to maintain their existence in the afterlife. The most famous example comes from after Hatshepsut's reign, when her successor Thutmose III ordered her name and image removed from many monuments. Historians still argue whether this represented political revenge or simply an attempt to maintain the fiction of unbroken male kingship. Either way, It demonstrates how control of written and visual media could extend power beyond death itself. One particularly quirky manifestation of propagandistic writing appears in what Egyptologists call pessimistic literature, texts that describe Egypt falling into chaos, only to be rescued by a wise ruler, conveniently resembling whoever currently held power. Works like the Prophecy of Nefertiti purport to be ancient predictions that just happen to legitimize the current regime as divinely ordained saviors. Imagine if today's politicians could commission ancient prophecies conveniently discovered right before election season. And lo, a leader shall come forth with unusual hair and a fondness for social media, and he shall make the nation great again. Actually, on second thought, perhaps we're not so different from the ancient Egyptians after all. The famous Tale of Sinuhe demonstrates how literary works could serve political purposes while maintaining artistic merit. This sophisticated narrative follows an Egyptian official who flees during a succession crisis, lives abroad, and eventually returns to Egypt. On its surface, it's an adventure story, but its underlying message reinforces the superiority of Egypt and the legitimacy of the ruler who welcomed Sinuhe back. Such works operated on multiple levels: entertainment for the elite, propaganda for the regime, and models of proper writing for scribal students. Think of it as the ancient equivalent of those Hollywood films that somehow always make the CIA or FBI look heroic, despite their complicated real-world histories. The battle for historical narrative extended beyond written texts to visual propaganda. Relief carvings showing the kings smiting enemies were ubiquitous in Egyptian art, but during civil conflicts, these enemies were carefully depicted to represent internal opponents. Subtle visual cues, hairstyles, clothing details, hieroglyphic labels identified these figures as specific Egyptian factions rather than traditional foreign enemies. To the untrained eye, these might look like standard victory scenes, but contemporary Egyptians would have recognized the political messaging targeting fellow Egyptians. Scribes themselves weren't immune from the conflicts they chronicled. Their elite status and proximity to power made them both influential and vulnerable. When cities fell or factions collapsed, associated scribes often faced harsh consequences. Some were executed as enemies of the state. Others were forced to literally rewrite their previous work to support new masters. Many fled with their patrons, becoming part of the educated diaspora that spread Egyptian cultural influence throughout neighboring lands. A poignant graffito from the first intermediate period, scratched in a remote desert location, records, "I, Senbi, scribe of the northern king, await here the judgment of the gods, for my hand has written both truth and falsehood." This rare moment of scribal self-reflection reveals the moral complexity these individuals navigated. The lasting impact of scribal propaganda extends into our modern understanding of ancient Egypt. Much of what we know about Egyptian history comes from texts created specifically to glorify certain rulers and erase others. Every dynasty portrayed itself as restoring order after a period of chaos. Every king claimed divine approval and cosmic significance. Every victory was absolute, and every defeat explained away as temporary or meaningless. When working with Egyptian historical texts, modern scholars must constantly ask, who commissioned this? What was their agenda? Whose voice has been silenced? It's like trying to reconstruct American history using only presidential campaign ads, technically informative, but requiring significant critical analysis. Archaeological evidence occasionally contradicts the scribal narrative, revealing the gap between propaganda and reality. Cities described as utterly destroyed in victory inscriptions show evidence of continuous habitation. Decisive victories commemorated on temple walls appear more ambiguous when battlefield remains are examined. The eternal peace proclaimed after conflicts often lasted mere years or decades before new struggles erupted. This disconnect between official history and archaeological reality reminds us to approach ancient texts with healthy skepticism. For the scribes themselves, civil wars created professional and ethical dilemmas that rarely appear in their polished official works. These highly educated individuals possessed deep knowledge of Egypt's cultural heritage and religious traditions. Therefore, they understood when they distorted that tradition for political expedience. Some scribal training texts hint at this tension, emphasizing the scribe's duty to speak ma'at, truth, justice, while acknowledging the practical need to serve those in power. The private tombs of scribes often contain subtle indications of this internal conflict, conventional loyalty phrases to the king they served publicly, alongside more personal expressions of their deeper values. So when we read the grand inscriptions proclaiming some pharaoh's divine right and cosmic victory, we should spare a thought for the nameless scribes who crafted these words. Men caught between truth and survival, between professional ethics and political necessity. Their pens may have served power, but their hidden doubts, preserved in fragile papyrus fragments and fading tomb inscriptions, remind us that propaganda has always been a human art, created by individuals who understood better than most the gap between the history they recorded and the messy, complicated truth they actually lived. A small family huddles at the edge of the desert, their few possessions bundled onto a struggling donkey. Behind them, smoke rises from their burning village. Ahead lies uncertain territory, perhaps safety, perhaps further danger. This poignant scene played out countless times during Egypt's civil wars, as ordinary people fled the fighting that had consumed their homes and livelihoods. For every soldier who fought, dozens of civilians fled, creating vast waves of internal displacement that reshaped Egyptian society and left lasting scars on the cultural landscape. Flight wasn't a choice made lightly. Egyptians possessed a profound attachment to place. Their identity, religious practices, and afterlife hopes were deeply rooted in specific localities. But when armies clashed and food supplies dwindled, survival trumped sentiment. Therefore, countless families abandoned ancestral homes, becoming refugees in their own land. Some fled short distances to neighboring nomes, provinces, where relatives might provide shelter. Others traveled hundreds of miles, seeking safety in remote oases or border regions. The most desperate crossed into foreign territories entirely, choosing the uncertain status of foreigner over the certain dangers of home. The journey itself claimed many victims. Travel in ancient Egypt followed the Nile or established desert tracks, routes easily monitored by warring factions. Fleeing families faced harassment at checkpoints, exploitation by guides, and the constant threat of bandits who thrived in the lawless conditions of civil war. Those traveling with elderly relatives or small children moved slowly, vulnerable to the elements and violence alike. One poignant artifact from the first intermediate period, a child's doll found abandoned along a desert route with a small bundle of clothing, speaks volumes about the hasty departures and harsh choices facing refugee families. I can't help but imagine some ancient Egyptian parent promising their sobbing child, "We'll come back for Mr. Whiskers the cloth cat later," knowing full well they never would, a heartbreaking lie repeated by refugee parents throughout human history. Archaeological evidence of these population movements appears in unexpected settlement patterns during periods of civil unrest. Sites that had been abandoned for centuries show sudden reoccupation. Remote desert locations reveal temporary encampments with distinctly Egyptian artifacts. Oasis communities that normally house just a few hundred inhabitants show evidence of rapid expansion, with hastily constructed dwellings crowding against existing structures. These refugee settlements lacked the careful planning typical of Egyptian towns. Think of them as the ancient equivalent of emergency FEMA trailers, functional but depressing, and certainly never meant to become permanent homes, though many inevitably did. The reception of Egyptian refugees in foreign lands varied dramatically depending on political circumstances and local resources. In Nubia, where Egyptian cultural influence was already significant, refugee communities sometimes integrated relatively smoothly. The fortress town of Buhen shows evidence of Egyptian refugee populations during the Second Intermediate period, with hybrid household arrangements suggesting intermarriage with local Nubians. Contrast this with the harsher treatment experienced by Egyptians fleeing to Canaan, where they often ended up as indentured laborers or slaves. An Egyptian autobiographical inscription from Byblos describes a refugee who ate the bitter bread of servitude in a foreign land where no man wishes to be. Historians still argue whether these refugee movements were primarily short-term displacement or resulted in permanent demographic changes. Some evidence suggests most displaced Egyptians eventually returned to their original homes when conflicts subsided. Other research indicates that significant populations never returned, permanently altering Egypt's ethnic and cultural landscape. The truth likely varied by time period and specific conflict, with some civil wars causing more permanent displacement than others. Cultural and linguistic challenges proved particularly difficult for refugees. While Egypt shared a common language and religious framework, regional dialects and practices varied significantly. A refugee family from the Delta might find themselves unable to fully understand the local dialect in Upper Egypt, marking them as outsiders despite their shared Egyptian identity. Religious practices also varied regionally, leaving displaced persons unable to properly worship their hometown deities. Imagine being forced to flee your hometown in Florida and ending up in rural Minnesota, technically the same country, but good luck finding a decent key lime pie or anyone who understands why you're so passionate about protecting sea turtle nesting sites. One particularly quirky aspect of refugee life appears in magical texts designed specifically to help displaced persons. These spells and rituals address the unique spiritual dangers faced by those forced from their homes, protection from unfamiliar local spirits, remedies for homesickness, and substitutions for religious practices requiring specific locations or materials now inaccessible. One fragmentary papyrus from the Second Intermediate Period contains what appears to be a ritual, allowing refugees to symbolically maintain their ancestral tomb cult, despite being unable to physically visit family burial places. Think of it as ancient Egyptian Zoom funeral technology. Not ideal, but better than nothing when you can't travel back to the family tomb due to that pesky civil war blocking your route. The special trauma of displacement in Egyptian culture stemmed from its emphasis on place and permanence. Their entire religious system centered on fixed locations, specific temples, tombs, and landmarks where interactions with the divine occurred. To be displaced meant more than physical hardship. It represented a spiritual crisis. The autobiographical inscription of Ankhtifi, a nomarch during the First Intermediate Period, captures this sentiment when he describes refugees as like birds who have lost their nests, homeless not just physically but cosmically. Modern refugees certainly suffer terribly, but at least they don't also believe they've been cut off from their chances of a decent afterlife on top of everything else. For the Egyptian elite, displacement often meant exile in foreign royal courts. Noble families who backed the losing side in civil conflicts frequently fled to neighboring kingdoms like Nubia, Libya, or various Levantine states. These high-status refugees brought Egyptian knowledge, technology, and cultural practices with them, becoming unintentional ambassadors of Egyptian civilization. The famous story of Sinuhe describes such an exile experience, with the protagonist rising to prominence in a foreign land while nursing a persistent homesickness for Egypt. Remarkably, archaeological evidence supports aspects of this literary account, with Egyptian-style tombs and artifacts appearing in unexpected locations during periods of civil unrest. Stories of return, both triumphant and tragic, pepper Egyptian records. The most fortunate refugees came home to intact properties and welcoming communities. Others returned to find their lands seized, their social positions lost, and their communities transformed beyond recognition. The Eloquent Peasant, a famous Middle Kingdom text, includes a character who laments, "I went away as a crocodile, powerful and feared, and return as a turtle, slow and vulnerable." A poetic expression of the diminished status many returning refugees experienced. This precarious position of returnees created lasting social tensions, as disputes over abandoned property and interrupted inheritance claims worked their way through Egyptian courts for generations. For those who never returned, displacement created new hybrid identities that would influence Egyptian history in unexpected ways. Refugees who settled permanently in border regions often maintained Egyptian cultural practices while adopting aspects of local culture. These frontier communities later served as cultural bridges during times of renewed Egyptian expansion. The Hyksos period, when foreign rulers controlled northern Egypt, may have been facilitated by generations of Egyptian refugees who had settled in the eastern delta and gradually integrated with Canaanite immigrants, creating a population with mixed loyalties and cultural practices. Archaeological evidence of population movements during civil wars appears in unexpected burial patterns. Traditional Egyptian burial practices were highly specific, with regional variations in tomb construction, body positioning, and grave goods. During periods of civil conflict, archaeologists find intrusive burial styles appearing far from their original regions. Clear evidence of displaced populations maintaining their hometown funerary traditions despite relocation. A cemetery near Thebes contains a distinct cluster of burials using Delta-style practices during the First Intermediate period, likely representing a refugee community that maintained its northern identity despite resettlement in the south. Some refugee communities maintained their distinctive identities for generations, creating permanent enclaves within Egypt. A settlement near Abydos shows evidence of a community originally from Heracleopolis that maintained their separate identity for over a century after the civil war that displaced them had ended. Their distinctive pottery styles, religious practices, and burial arrangements marked them as perpetual outsiders, even after 5 generations in their new home. The human tendency to cling to cultural identity in foreign surroundings hasn't changed much in 4,000 years. Just visit any Chinatown, Little Italy, or other ethnic enclave in modern cities for proof that refugee communities can maintain their distinctiveness for centuries. The lasting legacy of these displacement events extends far beyond the immediate suffering they caused. By forcing different Egyptian populations to mix and adapt, they created cultural exchanges that might never have occurred otherwise. Religious practices traveled with refugees, introducing regional cults to new areas. Technological knowledge spread as craftsmen resettled in new communities. Dialects mingled, enriching the language. Even cuisine evolved as displaced cooks adapted hometown recipes to locally available ingredients. These cultural cross-pollinations, born of tragedy but fruitful in their outcomes, remind us that human resilience can transform even the most devastating experiences into sources of innovation and renewal. So when we contemplate the millions displaced by modern conflicts, perhaps we can find both warning and hope in these ancient Egyptian refugee experiences. For even as these ancient families trudged reluctantly away from their burning villages, carrying their children and their cultural heritage into uncertain futures, they were not merely victims of history, but its creators, weaving new threads into the fabric of Egyptian civilization with each painful step toward exile and each determined journey home. The dust settles over a once thriving marketplace, now strewn with broken pottery and abandoned stalls. A solitary figure sweeps debris from the entrance of a damaged temple. Rebuilding after civil war proved just as monumental a task as the conflicts themselves. The physical reconstruction of cities and infrastructure required immense resources, but the deeper challenge lay in mending the torn social fabric of a society that had turned against itself. Peace wasn't simply the absence of fighting, but an active, ongoing process requiring as much determination and strategy as warfare had demanded. The immediate aftermath of civil conflict brought an eerie quiet. Battlefields fell silent, refugee streams slowed, but this apparent calm masked frantic activity as the victorious faction scrambled to establish control and legitimacy. New rulers faced daunting challenges. Therefore, their first days in power often determined whether peace would endure or fighting would resume. With resources depleted, populations traumatized, and trust shattered, even the most decisive military victory could unravel without careful management of the peace that followed. Many promising Egyptian reunifications collapsed within a generation because the difficult work of rebuilding was mishandled. Physical reconstruction began with the most essential infrastructure. Irrigation canals choked with debris or deliberately sabotaged during fighting needed immediate attention before the next growing season. Grain storehouses required rebuilding to prevent famine. Defensive walls needed repair to protect against opportunistic foreign attacks. The scale of this reconstruction often exceeded the damaged state's immediate capabilities. The famous Restoration Stela of Tutankhamun describes Egypt after the Amarna period as a land where the temples and the cities of the gods and goddesses were fallen into decay and their shrines were fallen into ruin, having become mere mounds overgrown with grass. While this text exaggerates for political effect, archaeological evidence confirms substantial rebuilding efforts following periods of internal conflict. Financing these massive reconstruction projects required creative solutions from Egyptian rulers. Some pharaohs, like Ramesses II, launched foreign military campaigns specifically to capture resources, including human labor, needed for domestic rebuilding. Others imposed special reconstruction taxes or redirected religious offerings toward practical rebuilding efforts. It's rather like those modern disaster recovery fundraisers, except instead of celebrity telethons, they had military campaigns against Nubians and Canaanites. For just the cost of one conquered city per day, you too can help rebuild an Egyptian temple. Religious reconstruction carried particular urgency in the Egyptian context. Temples weren't merely places of worship, but economic centers, agricultural managers, educational institutions, and symbols of cosmic order. Their restoration signified divine approval of the new regime. The Middle Kingdom pharaoh Mentuhotep II, who reunified Egypt after the First Intermediate Period, devoted enormous resources to temple construction at Thebes. These weren't vanity projects, but strategic investments in religious legitimacy and social cohesion. Think of it as ancient Egyptian infrastructure spending, but with more incense and animal sacrifices. One particularly quirky aspect of post-Civil War reconstruction appears in what Egyptologists call reburials, the careful collection and proper reinterment of bodies that had been hastily buried or left unburied during conflicts. Special crews of mortuary priests worked to identify remains, perform abbreviated mummification when possible, and provide proper burial with appropriate magical texts. One cache discovered at Deir el-Bahri contained over 40 reburied royal mummies, rescued from tombs damaged during periods of civil unrest. Even in death, it seems, the Egyptians practiced a form of disaster recovery. It's rather touching, if slightly macabre, like the world's most elaborate funeral catch-up service. Sorry about the delay in your journey to the afterlife, Pharaoh Sekenenre Tao. We've been having some political disagreements, but we're ready to send you off properly now. Economic recovery presented unique challenges. Trade routes disrupted by fighting needed re-establishment. Agricultural cycles thrown into disarray required careful management to restore productivity. Craftsmen who had fled or died during the conflict left skills gaps that took generations to fill. The archaeological record shows clear evidence of these economic disruptions in the form of changes in pottery styles and quality, with fine wares becoming scarcer and more utilitarian styles predominating immediately after conflicts. When you're rebuilding after a civil war, fancy decorated wine jugs understandably take a back seat to basic food storage containers, the ancient equivalent of prioritizing grocery stores over boutique chocolatiers in disaster recovery. Psychological healing may have been the most difficult aspect of reconstruction. Civil wars created deep wounds in the Egyptian sense of identity and cosmic order. Citizens who had seen neighbors kill neighbors and witnessed sacred spaces desecrated struggled to reconcile these experiences with their understanding of Ma'at, divine order. Various texts describe rituals specifically designed to cool the hearts of former enemies and unite the two lands in more than just political terms. These ceremonies often involved symbolic reconciliation between regional deities, reflecting the understanding that religious harmony needed to accompany political unification. Historians still argue whether these reconciliation efforts represented genuine attempts at healing or merely political theatre designed to pacify the population. Some evidence suggests that victorious factions sometimes incorporated elements of their defeated rivals' religious and cultural practices as a form of reconciliation. Other sources indicate harsh suppression of the losing side's identity and forced cultural assimilation. The reality likely varied considerably, depending on the specific conflict and the personalities of those managing the peace. Political reconciliation versus retribution represented a delicate balancing act for new rulers. Too much forgiveness might appear weak and invite future challenges. Too much punishment could create martyrs and drive resentment underground. The wisdom text known as the Instruction of Amenemhat advises a newly established king, "Be not lenient regarding your rights, but beware also of punishment, for healing comes after wounding." This pragmatic approach recognized that both excessive mercy and excessive harshness could undermine a fragile peace. Modern politicians handling post-conflict transitions face remarkably similar dilemmas, though they typically express their strategies in less poetic language and with considerably more PowerPoint slides. The restored pharaoh played a crucial ceremonial role in healing the nation's wounds. Royal progresses through recently contested territories allowed local populations to pledge loyalty directly to the victorious ruler. Grand festivals and public works projects demonstrated a return to normalcy and prosperity. The pharaoh's role as mediator between humanity and the gods took on special significance as the population looked for divine forgiveness and reassurance. Several Middle Kingdom texts describe pharaohs performing elaborate rituals to wash away the tears of every eye, poetic language for the emotional healing the population desperately needed. Lasting scars remained on both landscape and cultural memory despite these reconstruction efforts. Some cities never regained their former importance after being destroyed in civil conflicts. Regional identities that had been suppressed during reunification simmered beneath the surface, occasionally erupting in new conflicts generations later. Literary texts composed decades or even centuries after civil wars still reflected their traumatic impact, suggesting that cultural memory of these events persisted long after physical reconstruction was complete. Perhaps most telling are the preventive measures later pharaohs implemented to avoid repeating the cycle of fragmentation and civil war. Administrative reforms created more direct royal oversight of provincial governors. Religious innovations emphasized the divine nature of kingship even more strongly. Military restructuring reduced the power of regional commanders while expanding the pharaoh's personal guard. These systemic changes reflect hard-learned lessons about the fragility of Egyptian unity and the devastating cost of its collapse. The most successful periods of Egyptian history, the Middle and New Kingdoms, both followed traumatic civil wars and implemented significant reforms based on those experiences. The stable, glorious Egypt we picture when we think of pharaohs and pyramids wasn't the natural state of the civilization, but rather the product of painful learning from earlier failures. Much as modern constitutional democracies often emerge from periods of civil conflict with new safeguards against authoritarianism, ancient Egypt's most stable incarnations grew directly from the soil of previous collapse and careful reconstruction. Archaeological evidence shows these cycles of destruction and renewal in the very stones of Egyptian monuments. Temples and palaces bear the scars of intentional damage, followed by careful repair. Hieroglyphic inscriptions sometimes contain subtle indications of being recarved after defacement. Even royal statues occasionally reveal signs of having been reworked from earlier monuments. These physical palimpsests mirror the cultural ones, a civilization repeatedly broken and remade, carrying forward both the wounds and the wisdom gained from each cycle of civil conflict. So when we marvel at the seemingly timeless stability of ancient Egyptian civilization, remember that this impression is largely an illusion, the product of successful rebuilding rather than uninterrupted continuity. The true wonder of Egypt lies not in imagined permanence, but in resilience. The determined effort to rebuild order from chaos, meaning from confusion, and unity from division, over and over again, across thousands of years of human experience. A modern Egyptian farmer's hoe strikes something hard in the soil, a bronze arrowhead, silent witness to ancient bloodshed. The echoes of Egypt's civil wars continue to resonate through time, buried in the earth, encoded in cultural memory, and embedded in the very institutions that shaped this remarkable civilization. These internal conflicts weren't merely disruptive episodes in an otherwise stable history. They were transformative crucibles that fundamentally altered Egyptian culture, governance, and identity in ways that would echo for millennia, even into our present day. Perhaps the most profound legacy of these civil wars appears in the evolution of Egyptian kingship itself. The institution of pharaonic rule, often portrayed as unchanging and eternal, actually underwent dramatic transformations directly in response to internal conflicts. Early pharaohs of unified Egypt ruled through a relatively decentralized system, relying heavily on local governors and family connections. But repeated civil wars demonstrated the dangers of this approach. Therefore, later, dynasties increasingly centralized power, developed professional bureaucracies, and created standing armies loyal to the throne rather than to regional leaders. The god-king concept, so central to our image of ancient Egypt, intensified after each period of civil strife as a direct response to the existential threat these conflicts posed to Egyptian unity. Military organization experienced particularly dramatic evolution due to civil war experiences. The Middle Kingdom saw the development of more professional forces with specialized training, replacing the earlier system of provincial levies raised by local governors. New kingdom pharaohs went further, creating standing armies with dedicated officer corps and specialized divisions, including the first recorded naval infantry units in history. The famous military reforms of Horemheb following the Amarna period reorganized Egypt's forces specifically to prevent the factionalism that had enabled previous civil conflicts. It's rather like how modern democracies implement civilian control of the military to prevent coups, except instead of congressional oversight committees, the Egyptians used divine kingship and elaborate religious oaths. Slightly different approach, same general concern about generals getting too big for their ceremonial headdresses. Religious and artistic reflections of civil war trauma persisted long after peace returned. The pessimistic literature that emerged during the first intermediate period, texts like The Dialogue of a Man with His Bar and The Admonitions of Ipua, continued to be copied and studied for centuries, suggesting their themes of chaos and restoration resonated deeply in Egyptian consciousness. Visual art following civil wars often emphasized themes of order triumphing over chaos, with particularly elaborate depictions of the king smiting enemies who increasingly resembled internal rather than external foes. Imagine if your country's national monuments subtly referenced your recent civil conflict for the next 1,000 years, like Mount Rushmore with tiny inscriptions warning against the dangers of regional factionalism, or the Lincoln Memorial, including fine print about proper federal-state relations. One particularly quirky manifestation of Civil War legacy appears in what Egyptologists call execration texts, ritualized curses inscribed on pottery that was then ceremonially broken. While these existed throughout Egyptian history, their content evolved significantly following civil conflicts. Earlier versions targeted traditional foreign enemies, but after the first intermediate period, they increasingly included potential internal threats, specifically naming provincial governors, palace officials, and even generic categories like any Egyptian who might rebel. It's the ancient equivalent of your country's national prayer breakfast, including a specific petition to smite potentially disloyal members of the cabinet. A bit awkward for everyone involved, but apparently deemed necessary. The economic aftershocks of civil wars transformed Egyptian society in fundamental ways. Archaeological evidence shows increased fortification of grain storage facilities after each major internal conflict, reflecting painful lessons about food security during unstable times. Trade networks became more diversified, reducing dependence on single routes that could be disrupted by regional conflicts. Most significantly, land ownership patterns shifted dramatically after civil wars, with temple holdings and royal estates expanding at the expense of provincial elite families who had backed losing factions. These economic reorganizations, born of bitter experience, shaped Egyptian society for generations following each conflict. Historians still argue whether these civil wars ultimately strengthened or weakened ancient Egyptian civilization. Some scholars view them as necessary corrections that eliminated dysfunctional elements and stimulated beneficial reforms. Others see them as fundamentally traumatic events that drained resources and undermined the civilization's long-term viability. The truth likely encompasses both perspectives. These conflicts simultaneously damaged Egypt in the short term, while forcing adaptations that proved beneficial over longer periods, much like forest fires that devastate immediately but create conditions for new growth. The connections between ancient Egyptian civil strife and later Egyptian history reveal surprising continuities. When Ptolemaic rulers faced internal revolts in the late period, they implemented administrative reforms strikingly similar to those used by native pharaohs after earlier civil conflicts, suggesting institutional memory of effective responses persisted across millennia and even across cultural divides. During Roman rule, Egyptian rebellions followed geographical patterns, remarkably similar to earlier internal conflicts, with the same regional tensions and identities reasserting themselves despite the passage of centuries. It seems some fault lines in Egyptian society ran too deep to ever fully heal, reopening whenever central authority weakened, rather like that one family argument that somehow resurfaces at every holiday gathering, no matter how many generations pass. Looking beyond Egypt itself, these civil conflicts yielded unintended consequences for neighboring cultures. During periods of internal Egyptian weakness, technologies and skilled refugees flowed outward, accelerating development in Nubia, Libya, and the Levant. The Hyksos period, often portrayed as a simple foreign domination of Egypt, likely began as Egyptian elites in the Eastern Delta allied with Canaanite immigrants during civil conflicts, creating a hybrid culture that eventually dominated northern Egypt. This pattern of internal conflict creating opportunities for external influence recurred throughout Egyptian history, demonstrating how civil wars often transformed not just the warring society, but its entire geopolitical neighborhood. Universal lessons about human nature and societal breakdown emerge from studying these ancient conflicts. The preconditions for Egyptian civil wars sound disturbingly familiar to modern observers: economic inequality, regional identity politics, climate stresses affecting food production, elite factionalism, and declining trust in institutions. The progression from political tension to armed conflict followed predictable patterns that historians recognize across vastly different cultures and time periods. Perhaps civil wars reflect fundamental aspects of human social organization, stress points that appear whenever societies reach certain levels of complexity and strain. It's both disturbing and oddly comforting to realize our modern political dysfunctions have such ancient precedents, like finding out your weird family traditions actually date back to the Paleolithic. It doesn't fix anything, but at least you know it's not just you. The parallels with other civil conflicts throughout history are particularly striking. The regional nature of Egyptian factional identities mirrors similar dynamics in conflicts from the American Civil War to modern ethnic strife. The religious dimensions echo sectarian conflicts from medieval Europe to contemporary Middle Eastern tensions. Even the aftermath patterns, cycles of reconciliation and retribution, complex memory politics, and institutional reforms, follow recognizable templates seen in post-conflict societies worldwide. Civil wars, it seems, speak a universal language of human division and painful reunion, with remarkably consistent grammar regardless of when or where they occur. The most enduring legacy of Egyptian civil wars may be the evidence they provide of human resilience. Despite repeated descents into devastating internal conflict, Egyptian civilization rebuilt itself time after time over thousands of years. The same people who could turn against their neighbors with shocking brutality could also, when the fighting ended, find ways to live together again, rebuild shared institutions, and create new cultural syntheses from the fragments of the old. This pattern of destruction and renewal, division and reunification, appears so consistently in Egyptian history that it must reflect something fundamental about human social capacity, our remarkable ability to both tear apart and mend the fabric of our shared existence. Archaeological evidence of this resilience appears in the layered nature of Egyptian sites, where destruction levels are frequently followed by rebuilding phases incorporating elements from before the conflict, while adding innovations born from harsh experience. The great temples that tourists visit today often stand on foundations that have been repeatedly destroyed and rebuilt, their current forms representing the final iteration of structures that rose and fell with Egypt's internal conflicts. These physical palimpsests mirror the cultural ones. Each version of Egyptian civilization incorporated elements of its predecessors while adapting to prevent past failures. So, as the farmer's hoe continues to unearth ancient arrowheads from long-forgotten battlefields, we're reminded that civilizations aren't defined merely by their moments of glory, but equally by how they navigate their darkest chapters. The true measure of a society lies not in avoiding conflict entirely, perhaps an impossible standard, but in what it learns from its periods of self-destruction and how it rebuilds from the ashes. By this measure, ancient Egypt stands as one of humanity's most remarkable achievements. Not a civilization that never broke, but one that knew how to put itself back together, stronger and wiser, time and time again. The Nile flows on, indifferent to the blood it has carried. As our journey through ancient Egypt's civil wars comes to a close, I hope you've gained a deeper appreciation for the brutal realities that periodically shattered this magnificent civilization. These weren't just footnotes in Egypt's long history, but transformative crucibles that repeatedly reshaped the very foundations of this ancient society. The glittering monuments and serene temple walls that captivate modern tourists conceal a turbulent past of brother fighting brother, families torn apart, and divine kings meeting undivine ends. What strikes me most about these conflicts isn't just their violence, but their profound contradictions. Egypt, a civilization renowned for its stability and continuity, repeatedly descended into devastating internal strife. The culture that created some of humanity's most enduring monuments also periodically engaged in self-destruction. The society that elevated harmony and cosmic order to religious principles also experienced some of antiquity's most chaotic breakdowns of social cohesion. But these contradictions aren't truly contradictory. Therefore, they reveal something essential about both ancient Egypt and ourselves. Stability and chaos, creation and destruction, unity and division aren't opposites, but complementary aspects of the same human experience. The remarkable resilience of Egyptian civilization deserves particular attention. Despite these periodic ruptures, Egyptian culture maintained core continuities across thousands of years. The same religious concepts, artistic conventions, and cultural values re-emerged after each collapse, altered by the experience but recognizably Egyptian. Perhaps this resilience stemmed from Egypt's intimate connection with natural cycles of destruction and renewal. The annual Nile flood that devastated the landscape also brought the fertile silt that enabled new growth, a pattern mirrored in Egypt's political history of collapse and rebirth. It's rather like how some modern families can have explosive holiday arguments, but still somehow maintain those annual gatherings for generations. The ability to fall apart and come back together seems to be a defining feature of systems that endure, whether families or ancient civilizations. As you lie there in your comfortable bed, perhaps drifting towards sleep, consider the vast gulf separating your peaceful night from the restless darkness experienced by Egyptians during these conflicts. No sirens wail in your neighborhood. No soldiers pound on your door demanding grain or conscripts. No refugees stream past your window seeking safety from approaching armies. This contrast isn't meant to induce guilt, but gratitude, and perhaps a moment's reflection on how quickly the stable structures of any society can unravel when pushed to their breaking points. One of history's most valuable functions is to help us recognize patterns that transcend particular times and places. The preconditions for Egyptian civil wars sound disturbingly familiar. Regional identity politics, economic inequality, elite factionalism, environmental stresses affecting food production, and declining trust in institutions. Historians still argue whether these ancient patterns offer useful warnings for modern societies or merely reflect coincidental similarities across vastly different contexts. Either way, studying these ancient conflicts provides valuable perspective on our own societal tensions. If nothing else, reminding us that humans have been navigating similar challenges for millennia, with varying degrees of success and failure. A particularly quirky aspect of Egyptian civil war history appears in how archaeological evidence sometimes contradicts the official narratives. The famous Middle Kingdom reunification under Mentuhotep II, portrayed in royal propaganda as a divinely ordained restoration of proper order, looks considerably messier in the archaeological record. Evidence suggests a protracted, brutal campaign with multiple reversals and compromises before stability was achieved. It's the ancient equivalent of those carefully curated social media posts showing a family's perfect vacation while concealing the 3 meltdowns, one lost suitcase, and that regrettable seafood choice that had everyone hugging the hotel toilet for a day. History, like Instagram, tends to preserve the highlight reel while editing out the messy bits. The battle scars of Egypt's civil conflicts remain visible today for those who know where to look. At Karnak Temple, you can still see places where royal names were chiseled out during periods of internal strife, only to be restored by later rulers seeking to mend the historical record. In museum collections worldwide, statues bear the subtle marks of deliberate damage and subsequent repair, physical manifestations of Egypt's cycle of political violence and reconciliation. Even the famous gold mask of Tutankhamun, when carefully examined, shows evidence of having been adapted from a piece originally created for someone else, possibly a casualty of the post-Amarna power struggles. These material remnants remind us that civil conflicts don't just unfold in abstract political spaces but leave tangible, enduring scars on cultural landscapes. The ancient Egyptians themselves had a complex relationship with the memory of their civil wars. Official histories often minimize these episodes, portraying them as brief aberrations, quickly corrected by divinely sanctioned rulers. But private writings, artistic themes, and religious innovations reveal a deeper grappling with the trauma these conflicts inflicted. The tension between official narratives, emphasizing continuity, and lived experiences of rupture, created a complex memory politics, not unlike what we see in modern post-conflict societies. Ancient Egyptians were no more monolithic in how they processed their civil wars than modern Americans are in how they understand their civil war, or contemporary Cambodians in how they relate to the Khmer Rouge period. As we conclude our exploration of Egypt's civil wars, I want to leave you with a thought about what these ancient conflicts might teach us. Perhaps their greatest lesson isn't about the fragility of civilization, though that's certainly part of it, but about the remarkable human capacity for both destruction and renewal. The same people who could turn against their neighbors with shocking brutality could also, when the fighting ended, find ways to live together again, rebuild shared institutions, and create cultural beauty from the fragments of what was broken. This dual capacity for division and reconciliation, for shattering unity and painstakingly restoring it, seems fundamental to the human experience across time and cultures. In the coming nights, I'll share other journeys through fascinating but lesser-known aspects of human history. We might explore the surprisingly sophisticated medical practices of medieval monasteries, uncover the hidden social revolutions triggered by changes in cooking technology, or travel the ancient spice routes that connected distant civilizations long before the modern concept of globalization. If you've enjoyed tonight's exploration of ancient Egyptian civil conflicts, I hope you'll join me for these future historical adventures. For now, though, rest easy in the knowledge that while human history contains much darkness, it also reveals our remarkable ability to find our way back to the light, to rebuild what was broken, to restore what was lost, and to learn, however imperfectly, from our most catastrophic mistakes. Sleep well, dear listener, beneath the same stars that once shone down on ancient Egypt in both its glory and its suffering, silent witnesses to humanity's eternal cycle of destruction and creation.